Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a Premier Field Engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is part 9 of an ongoing series focusing on ConfigMgr Current Branch and the Microsoft Cloud, Azure. Today's discussion is specifically focused on management options. So this is not a discussion of a particular feature, if you will, in ConfigMgr. I'll probably say this again, right? It's more of a discussion of using ConfigMgr between different environments, Azure, on-prem, that kind of thing, right? So this is also a session that I did a while back, and I'm reusing it for this series, and the content is still the same. PowerPoints look a little bit different than some of the others, but that's okay. The content is still the same, so we will keep this and keep going. So up until now, we've talked about leveraging ConfigMgr and some of the services that are in ConfigMgr to hook in to, or I should say, we've talked about using ConfigMgr to hook into some of the services that are provided in the Microsoft Cloud, rather than actually talking about ConfigMgr in the Microsoft Cloud, managing in the Microsoft Cloud, and other types of scenarios. So that's what this session is all about, right? So here's the agenda that we're going to go through. We're going to work our way up to what's really probably the most interesting part of the discussion, which are the demos, right? So to get started, what is this session about, right? Well, this session is a discussion, again, of the management options scenarios that can be brought to bear for extending ConfigMgr management capabilities to and from and between Azure, right? Now, there's a lot of scenarios that you could go down to talk about how you do this. So I'm not going to try to get into every single one of the scenarios, just going to try to show you a few examples to help you understand how it might work and so forth. But a lot more things than I can show in the time allotted here in terms of configuration options. So also this session is a discussion of Azure itself, that it is just a natural extension to your data center, right? Sometimes we think of Azure being this thing in the cloud, and it is, and it's not a data center that necessarily is owned by the organization. It's a Microsoft data center, but Azure is just like any data center that you would operate with. Largely, you're going to put resources there. You're going to control the resources there. You're going to manage the resources there. It's a data center that has, frankly, more functionality because of some of the services built into Azure and so forth. But in terms of getting to Azure and the networking required to Azure and all those kinds of things, common kind of scenarios that we think about just managing our own data centers that we do today. Now, this is not a session intended to be an in-depth discussion of how to configure ConfigMgr to work in Azure. I mean, that discussion really is one that we probably don't even need to have, because when we think about the different data centers and what pieces to put there and the networking and all of that, skills that are common, whether in Azure or totally on-prem, etc., right? This also is not a discussion of the specific details that you need to consider in terms of putting systems in Azure, getting ConfigMgr ready to go in Azure in whatever form, site server, site system, whatever, right? Certainly those details are important. Details such as VM sizing, the configuration of the VM, the configuration of the Azure environment. Yet those are details pretty easily talked about elsewhere, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them here. All right. Now, so the three scenarios where ConfigMgr can play with Azure. Well, the first one is not even an Azure thing. Kind of could be, right? If you run ConfigMgr on-prem. Now, if you run ConfigMgr strictly on-prem, then Azure's not really a consideration. I say it kind of can be because unless you're talking about everything being on-prem or everything being in Azure, then you're talking about a hybrid environment, right? If everything you're doing is on-prem, then you're not factoring in Azure at all. If everything you're doing is in Azure, then you're not factoring in on-prem at all. If you're doing hybrid, which is very much probably the most likely scenario to be of value, then you do factor in what do you put on-prem, what do you put in Azure. The answer can be different depending on the needs that you have, right? So this is one scenario I'll illustrate. Again, lots of things that you could do differently than what I will do. I'm just showing that it can be done and how it would be done. Now, in terms of benefits of Azure and ConfigMgr and managing, right? So there are a few, and this is just a list of things that I kind of put together to talk to. I'm sure that you could add others to the list, and that's fine, but at least some things to get us started, right? So one common thing that might be a factor in a given network environment would be challenges that happen on-prem. Those same challenges may not exist in Azure, right? So going to Azure, putting resources in Azure could really help you alleviate some network or infrastructure bottlenecks, right? By using Azure, you could decrease the dependence on dedicated and sometimes slow infrastructure. I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. You could argue that there's a decrease in the amount of maintenance that needs to happen. It's not a network anymore that you own. Some of it might be, depending on how you connect to Azure, but a lot of it now is moved into Azure, and so we own the maintenance of the networking for that, right? Local office internet connections may already be faster than the WAN connectivity to data centers. That's definitely a consideration. Again, I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. Right? And there could be some other things. So a couple of examples come to mind. So I'm thinking of one customer that is a very, very large retail customer, and they have many thousands of locations, and as they in their global infrastructure, and as you look at their environment, what's interesting about it is there are 3 locations really that serve as the hub, if you will, of network activities feeding into thousands of their retail locations. So it could be that one hub serves itself many thousands of retail locations, and another hub another several thousand retail locations, and so forth. And what's interesting is whenever we look at the the bottlenecks of this, all of those retail locations are connected to these network hubs, if you will. And there was a discussion about trying to copy content out to servers, not even a config manager discussion, just copying content out to servers in these locations. And the links between the locations and the hubs weren't all that robust, but the bigger challenge was that this location was really constrained. There was a small pipe to get all of the data from the data center to the networking hub. All that to say, whenever we ran the calculations, it was about a 3 gig file that the customer was trying to distribute. When we ran the calculations to see how long it would take to get that file to all of the retail locations and come to consistency, the estimate panned out to be about, as I recall, 1.5 years. Right? So a substantial amount of time. But if you look at these same locations, each one had an internet connection and a substantially faster internet connection. So doing the calculation how long it would take to move that same content to those retail locations using a combination of Azure and the internet connection, we reduced from 1.5 years to about a week. And that's the direction that was chosen, and off we went to get it done, right? Another location that I'm thinking about had really challenged networking links between data centers on the order of 3 or 350 millisecond latency, and also the links were fairly saturated. 90% might be a really nice sized link, but 90% saturated. So trying to get traffic across that in any kind of predictable way, which ConfigMgr needs, certainly for some of the site system to site server communication and site server to site server communication and so on, real challenging, right? But you look at the internet connections that these locations had, they were not nearly as taxed. So in that case, started talking about making some moves with ConfigMgr up into Azure. Started going that way, really good story to tell, and solve some problems, right? So that's not necessarily a situation that fits every environment. Obviously, every environment would have to look at the challenges, the uniqueness, and make decisions, right? But it's just things, those are just things to think about. Additional management options. So systems running in Azure, they need management as well, right? So I've heard of several environments that have started putting machines in Azure. They have ConfigMgr completely on-prem, and those machines sitting in Azure just don't have any management, right? Well, that's if it's important to manage systems on-prem, it's certainly important to manage those systems in Azure. Leveraging ConfigMgr, some of the ways that we can bridge the gap between on-prem and Azure really provides a pretty cool solution, right? There's other things, again, services in Azure that ConfigMgr can take care of. Examples that we've talked about: Cloud Management Gateway, Cloud Distribution Point. There's others. Right? And so those options start to open up additional possibilities for management that maybe weren't as easy to do before, right? So certainly things that are worth considering. In terms of cost, now this one's an odd one because yes, Azure is a service that has a cost associated. You will be billed for the usage of VMs and networking and different things that are in Azure each month. But there have been a number of customers that look at the numbers of how much it costs to maintain their own infrastructure, how much it costs to maintain physical hardware and associated expenses, and it actually works out to be a cost savings, maybe a significant cost savings, to move some of that infrastructure to Azure, and then the benefits that come along with it. Reliability. So system performance that you choose is something that we are responsible for, right? So there are a whole bunch of different VMs, as an example, that you could choose to go with, VM sizes and such. If you choose a VM and it's slated to deliver a certain amount of performance, then that's a reliability that is incumbent upon Azure to produce that, right? Now remember, ConfigMgr runs as infrastructure as a service, not platform as a service. So in that vein, you will need to configure your virtual machines, choose the right ones, make sure they're configured the way you want them, and so forth, right? All right, so let's look at some of the requirements for ConfigMgr and Azure. Right? There's really just a couple that I want to cover. The first is connectivity. So there are 3 options for connectivity to get from your location to Azure. Right? The biggest and most recommended one is called ExpressRoute. Now this is something where you might have multiple locations. There's a dedicated pipe for you where those locations can communicate up to Azure in the cloud. Again, just kind of an extension of your data center. And this is fully supported for ConfigMgr, the preferred way to do it for ConfigMgr. A couple of other options here. This is, again, a natural data center extension. This ExpressRoute is not using the public internet. It's a dedicated circuit for the organization, unlimited and not metered connection. There's higher security, higher reliability, and lower and consistently lower latencies. You have a choice of the speeds you want on this connection, anywhere from 50 megabits per second to 10 gigabits per second. So up to you, right? So this is awesome if you can do it. But not every organization can. So there's also an option called site to site. This is where you have a site that is connected to Azure all the time through a VPN, right? All the systems in this site are able to access Azure as needed and get to resources in Azure, and Azure can see, depending on networking, the systems on site. So this is also supported for ConfigMgr. It uses VPN. It does use the internet, and it uses IPsec and IKE. The speeds of this vary. Now the third option is not supported by ConfigMgr. It is the option I'm using in my lab that you will see shortly. So don't be confused when you see point to site and what I'm doing, because I don't really have any choice with the networking constraints that I have. It's fine for testing and demo and different things, but it's absolutely not supported for ConfigMgr. It does use VPN. The idea of this is that you will establish a VPN tunnel point to site to Azure. So I have 3 machines. I'll have 3 point-to-site tunnels to be able to access resources in Azure. Right? In addition to that, and also in case you didn't notice, the thickness of the line indicates kind of the speed and performance and preference and that kind of thing. Right? So a little visual cue. In addition to that, with ConfigMgr, you're going to have to factor in Azure VMs. So those Azure VMs could simply be clients. They could be config manager site servers. They could be site systems, DPs, MPs, SUPs, those kinds of things. But definitely want to make sure that you have the right size, right speed, and right disk configuration for your Azure VMs. One of the nice things about Azure is that you can switch that on the fly. If you make a choice that's too slow, just change the VM criteria and things adjust. If you choose something that's not needed in terms of the speed and just costing extra money per month to have, then scale it down, and no problem at all. Before we get to the actual demos and see them, just kind of want to draw up a couple of scenarios. So the first scenario, easiest, config manager in Azure, clients in Azure, right? Everything self-contained in Azure. So we have a few pieces that will all come into play. This is me just trying to diagram it out to help it make sense a bit, right? Because you'll see these terms, resource group and storage account and virtual network and location and all of that. And it's important to know kind of how these fit together. So in a location, now I'll put an asterisk around this. There are some places where what I'm about to say might have some more flexibility, but still, just to kind of simplify. So in terms of location, whenever you build resources, you will choose where they actually reside and function, right? So in order, for example, if I were to build a resource group in a different location than where I'm trying to add storage and different things, I couldn't see all of that. It really needs to be in common. So here I have my resource, my location, which is really a container for my resource group. My resource group is a collection of resources that are in common. So resource group, I'll have my storage. So think of disks in that sense, where I will store the information and such that might be needed by my VMs and other things, at least in this context. You'll have your virtual network. So just like you have networking in your on-prem scenario, you will also have networking that you need to build out in Azure. The virtual network is where you do that. That's what your systems, your VMs will be able to leverage and use as they communicate with each other. Then you'll have your lab cloud service. This contains a number of things possibly, but in this case it contains my VMs. So for this example, all I have is a site server, and then I have my domain controller, which is also a config manager client. Because these are all in the same resource group, my VMs can access the lab storage account, which I've configured onto it, can access the virtual network, which I've configured onto it, and everyone is able to communicate. Now, we do have this gateway out here. In this case, everything's self-contained in Azure. I don't need this gateway, but the gateway is something that you could actually not have it in this scenario because it's all in Azure. But the gateway is something that facilitates communication from the outside to the inside of Azure, right? And it's just an important, just like any gateway, right? Nothing new here. So that's easy. All contained in Azure. We'll see that shortly. Now let's change it a bit. So now we have Config Manager in Azure, a client on-prem. So the same exact thing. I have my domain controller because why? This client is a member of this domain. It's joined the domain. Now it doesn't have to be, right? We can manage it without it being a member of the domain, no problem, just a workgroup kind of scenario. But in this case, it's a member of the domain because I'm connected by an express route connection or a site-to-site VPN, or in my case, a point-to-site VPN because that's all I have, and I can talk into my domain controller, join the domain. I can be managed by my site server. You'll see that in just a minute, right? So that's all that changes there. Or the third scenario where we have ConfigMan on premises, and then distribution points and the client in Azure. So here I've changed it a bit. I've eliminated my two other VMs, not because they're gone, they're still there, but this system is uniquely part of the domain that is on-prem. And now I don't show my domain controller here. It's tailspintoys.com is the domain name, so you'll see that. But through this same connection, I'm able to treat this machine VM as a distribution point, work with it as a client, all of those kinds of things, right? So diagrams are great. Let's actually step into this and see a few demos. Now, what I want to do, there's three key demos, the same scenarios that I showed you in the diagrams. I want to show you live. But before we get started, again, this is not an intention to to really go in detail about the lab, about the configuration of how to get everything working in Azure, but thought it might be interesting to at least see what I did here to get things connected. So I have, let me pull up the Azure console. It's just a web browser. Let me get that going real quick. Right, so I will just launch Azure. All right, so let me pull that in. Azure's coming up. Take it just a second. All right, got hung up there for a second. It looks like it's trying to come up now. There it comes. All right, so I have Azure, everything related to Azure. The thing that I care about are my virtual machines, right? So I have my virtual networks, virtual machines up here. Here they are. And so I have the 3 virtual machines. I have my domain controller. This is a domain controller for fourthcoffee.com. I have my site server, again, in the domain fourthcoffee. And then I have this system, which is an extension of On-prem. So this system is not part of fourthcoffee. It's part of Tailspin Toys, right? If I pick one of these VMs, I just choose the DC and look, then I see the information about it. I'll see the location where it is, the subscription, where it's applied, the size of the VM. If I keep digging through here, I'll see, like, here's the resource group that it's part of, and then the storage sets and virtual networks, and off we go, right? All that's discoverable. So that's here. Now, if I want to connect to this, which I do, right? Because the first example, the first scenario is simply Azure contains systems managing there, which is pretty common, then, or not different than what we think about with on-prem only. Then all I have to do is click on this, hit connect, and that's going to open up and launch an RDP session. So I'll just log into it real quick. Oops, if I know the right password. There. So I'll get an RDP session to this system. Off we go. I'll connect to that. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So I'll pull that aside. The other one that I want to connect to is right here. Right, so I'll connect. Open that up. And I'm probably going to close these as I get done with them because, believe me, well, maybe it's just me, but this got me confused trying to go between all these VMs, even with the names. Oh, that's fine. I confused myself. I went to the wrong one because of defaults. Anyway, let me go find the different user account. Okay, so that should work. And we'll get a remote connection to it as well. And then we will pull it aside. So this is actually set up. Now, what I want to show you before I get into those VMs, I also, both of those that I just pulled up, they are Azure resources. So being in Azure resources, I don't need to worry about trying to connect them to on-prem. What I need to worry about, now I certainly need to have the networking there to do it. But what I mean in this case, I need to make sure I have a VPN established to Azure so that I can connect in to Azure from my on-prem infrastructure, right? So just to show that before, actually let me hold that. I'll wait on that because I'll get to that here in a minute with the other demos and I'll show it not to add confusion. So here is my domain controller that's running in Azure and it is being managed by the site server in Azure. So if I go to my control panel and look under ConfigMan, then I will see that it is actually being managed by the fourthcoffee management point. If I look at the actions, I have all of the actions here. If I look at the site, I have the correct site code. Now the one possible confusion, the site code is in common between my site server on-prem and my site server in Azure. Not a big deal, it works fine, but just visually maybe a little bit confusing. All right, so that's all there, and it works. And so I know it works because if I go ahead and pull this out and pull my ConfigMgr instance, also in the cloud, in, I will see my domain controller right here as active with information fresh from today in terms of policy request. I have the green check mark and so forth. So this is all working, all good, no problem, right? Okay. So now that's one scenario. Let me go ahead and pull this out and go back to the PowerPoint. So that's one scenario. That's this one, right? And I've kind of shown you part of this, and I'll get to the rest of it probably now. The next is ConfigMgr in Azure, which is what I just showed you, and then the client on-prem, right? So I have designated the client on-prem by name, so I know, and so that would be extension of Azure. So that would be a client that's on-prem, but it's extending Azure's management, at least in my attempt to have something to remind myself. And so it's an on-prem client managed by Azure. Okay. Now, in order for that to work, I have to establish my connection to Azure. Again, you would not normally have to do that. The connection to Azure would already be established because you have either ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN. In my case, I did not have that. So I had to go create a connection using point-to-site. Now, I'm not going to get into point-to-site and how that works, but you can see here that I am connected through point-to-site to Azure. You can see here that I have IPs. I have an IP assigned from Azure. So if you were to look at my networking, the actual network of the VMs is a 172 network. The actual network or IP of my on-prem is a 192 network. The 10 dot network is the IP of my gateway. So I have a gateway address, which means I should be able to ping my on-prem or my in Azure resources. So let me do that. So the domain controller is 20. I can ping it, no problem. I could net view to it, probably. Let's try that. I don't think I've tried that with this, but it should work. Right? Okay, access denied, whatever, but at least it got there. I can ping my site server. That's my ConfigMgr site server in Azure. And I can ping my other system in Azure that is not part of the Fourth Coffee domain. It's part of the Tailspin Toys domain, which you'll see in just a minute. But the point is I can get to all of the resources that I need to. And so this system should be completely managed without any problem at all in Azure. So if I go to my control panel and look at my ConfigMgr environment, I will see, in fact, it is managed by Fourth Coffee in Azure, has the same site code, SAP, in Azure, and has all of the actions. So this is managed. So if I go look for CMX Azure in the domain, then I should be able to find it. So let's go look. Okay. So CMX Azure. Now this one, I think there's some interesting connectivity I probably need to fix in terms of routing or whatever, because it is fully managed, but it shows the red X in terms of communication. You see it has all the policies, so that high-speed channel might just be being affected. Not sure, but certainly it's connected as of today, and you see it's a fully functioning client. So no problem there at all, right? All right, so the last scenario is that I have ConfigMgr on-prem and a DP client in Azure. So let me go hook that up. I've got two VMs here. Let me go find the right one. Here's the on-prem ConfigMgr. Got it. Let's pull it to the side. And then that's really all we need, right? So I have that, and then I will launch the Azure one. Let's pull that back in and grab this one and launch an RDP session to it. Open that. And now this time I am logging into tailspintoys.com. So let's use that. Good enough. So we'll make the connection. I will get rid of Azure at this stage because I don't need it, I don't believe, any longer. Assuming this connects. All right, and there it comes. Good enough. So this client is out there, and we'll start here, right? Actually, let's start here. So I have this client, it is installed. Now I know, because I did something stupid a minute ago, that this is going to show as a not fully assigned client because it's kind of in process of doing things. I've got the actions, I've got the site assigned, and it's, I messed this up a minute ago, but it's talking to Tailspin Toys, right? No problem. The one piece that I know is here, and so I can show you this, is my distribution point. So the client will work here in a bit. The distribution point is also on the system. So I have my content library, and I've actually staged a couple of things up here. I've got content in my package lib, the package 2, 3, 7, and 8. So 4 pieces of content. Got content in the file lib, right? You can see they were staged a couple of days ago as of this recording. And data lib. So all this is working. So I have a functioning connection from my on-prem Azure to my client. Now let's go look further at that in my on-prem config manager. And so if I look in assets and compliance, under all systems, I will have the lab server X. I actually have both Azure and on-prem, I realize, because this is one that shouldn't be there. I'm going to go ahead and delete it because it's actually not assigned here. And then I have the X on-prem. So it shows active from before whenever I messed it up. There we go. It shows active from before when I messed it up. You see that it communicated as of earlier today, so it was definitely online. And it's just kind of in that weird state. This is also a distribution point. So if I go to my software library and look under packages, I can go to my ConfigMgr package, go to properties on it, and look at my content location, and I see, in fact, it is a distribution point. Everything shows successful to this, shows successful to this other one, and the other 2 pieces of content are boot images, I believe. So we're good here, right? So again, all 3 scenarios, being able to manage directly in Azure, manage when ConfigMgr is in Azure, the client's on-prem, manage when ConfigMgr is on-prem, and the client, or the DP in this case, is in Azure. So indefinitely multiple combinations of things that I was not able to show you just because there's so many things that I could set up, right? But it gives you a flavor, hopefully, of how this works. Last thing that I want to discuss, and it's really just an afterthought, really. There will be those environments that need to migrate, that maybe the decision has been made to move an infrastructure to Azure. But it's a production infrastructure, and you either can rebuild and start over, or you can just migrate to Azure. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. One would be backup and restore. So you could just use our traditional ConfigMgr backup. So it says CAS. You could use it even with just a standard primary site. So you could restore your CAS from a primary that might already be in Azure. So if you have an infrastructure in Azure, it was kind of spanning between ConfigMgr and Azure, you want to put the CAS up in Azure with the primary, you could restore from a primary, or you could even restore from a primary on site once the CAS is in Azure, no problem, as long as you have connectivity. Or you could restore CAS from the database, either way. Another option, P2V, physical to virtual, or V2V, virtual to virtual, totally supported. So with that, kind of puts the bow around what I wanted to talk about today, talking about using Azure to host ConfigMgr and back and forth and so on. So we will wrap the session there, and we will see you next time.